Welcome to the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson, and this podcast series is a conversation with Matt, the Bearded Naked Yogi. In this 10-episode series, we're delving deep into the core principles of yoga, shedding light on its ancient wisdom and timeless teachings. Matt is taking us through the 8 limbs of yoga, sharing his philosophy and revealing the essence of this ancient practice. Matt, this is episode 3 of the series. What are we covering this time around?
Hey Gareth. So, as we dive into episode 3, we are going to be exploring the second of the 8 limbs of yoga, which is known as Niyama or the Niyamas. And Niyama is a Sanskrit word that is literally translated as the attitudes that we adopt towards ourselves.
And when you talk about the Niyamas, it sounds plural. I'm guessing there's a few dimensions to this limb of yoga. Break it down for us. What are the elements that are part of the Niyamas?
It is. So there are a few dimensions to this. And just as we discussed in episode 2 on the yamas, the Niyamas are 5 principles that an aspiring yogi would examine and adopt as part of their own aspirational path. And just to give a quick overview here, we have the principle of saucha, we have the principle of santosha, perhaps one of the loveliest words in the Sanskrit language. The third principle around tapas, the fourth principle, svadhyaha, and the fifth principle here, a real tongue twister, is vara pranidhanar. The niyamas, alongside the yamas, provide a structure for cultivating a relationship. And within the context of the niyamas, it is the relationship that we cultivate within ourselves.
And that concept of cultivating a relationship with ourselves, it's a fairly big part of yoga, isn't it? I mean, how do these 8 limbs of yoga help us to cultivate a relationship with ourselves?
So the 8 limbs of yoga, as we've discussed before, essentially provide the aspiring yogi or the seeker of self-understanding with a very clear set of personal but also timeless ethical, physical and mental disciplines that are practiced consistently within the journey of self-discovery and perhaps taking it further into a journey of self-realization. Now, the 8 limbs are viewed as a very clear set of guiding principles that enable the yogi to lead a disciplined and purposeful life. And there's that word again, disciplined, as we discussed in episode 2. Discipline is not a word that is warmly embraced within the modern age. Our lives are very free-flowing and very reactive and responsive to the circumstances in which we find ourselves in. But cultivating a little bit of self-discipline and introducing that sense of discipline towards our lives is a marvellous, marvellous thing. It gives us something to work with, and it gives us something to work towards. I think it's important here, and certainly as we begin to get into the real heart of yoga, that we acknowledge that these 8 limbs are not an absolute dogmatic set of rules to follow without questions. We're not talking about the 10 commandments here. There's a responsibility to anyone that takes up a path of yoga or a path of self-examination to learn, to study and to understand how these guiding principles are to be applied to their own lives and to their own individual experience. A yogi must always be aware that the individual journey is as unique as the practitioner themselves.
Well, let's dive into the Niyamas. As you've outlined, there's 5 of them, and the first is saucha. How do we engage with the Niyama of saucha?
Saucha perhaps is one of the easiest of the niyamas to engage with. Saucha refers to the practice of purity and cleanliness and a clearness and clarity in one's words, in one's thoughts, but also in terms of one's own physical body. Now, saucha as a principle is considered essential for a healthy body and a healthy mind, and it applies equally to the outer and inner form of who we are. Now, this sense of purity and clearness and clarity is and can be achieved in very different ways. We can think in terms of physical exercises, keeps the body strong, clears the mind. You know, if you've ever felt foggy in your thoughts, we all know the benefits of a good workout or a good yoga practice in terms of clearing the mind and helping one to remove negative thoughts. And it's also achieved through a good diet, an examination of one's own thoughts through self-reflection and understanding in order to identify and remove strong and powerful feelings, perhaps within the experience. I like to think of saucha. Use an example here of a window. Now, there's nothing to say that we are inherently impure or unclean, or we lack clarity, or we lack clearness. But perhaps if we look at a window that hasn't been cleaned for 3 months, now the window performs its job perfectly well. It lets light in and allows us to see out. But with a little bit of attentiveness, with a little bit of awareness, perhaps the window could be just that little bit cleaner. What happens? There is a little more light that is let in. There is a little bit more capacity for our own eyes to look out. That's really what this sense of clearness or clarity means when we come to this principle of saucha.
Nice. I like the window analogy. That's a good one. The second of the niyamas is santosha. What does this entail?
One of the most beautiful, beautiful words within the language of Sanskrit. The niyama of santosha refers to contentment and satisfaction, the cultivation of contentment and satisfaction. And this contentment is with ourselves, and it is with our situation in life. It's a satisfaction with the experience of our lives, and a cultivation perhaps of a sense of detachment from our constantly evolving wants and desires. And as we've mentioned in a previous episode, that sense of desire is considered one of the great poisons of humanity. Always wanting more, what's next, what's coming, making things bigger, bang, bang, bang. But this principle of contentment, it all comes down to that cultivation of awareness. And again, this real fundamental practice behind yoga. When we take the time to sit down and examine our own lives and examine our experiences, those desires, those needs and those wants, we cultivate that sense of contentment that what we have is more than enough. That contentment with how things are. Now, things are precisely as they are. And our desire to change things, our desire for more, is usually the cause of some of the greatest sufferings in life. So I really do encourage people to think about this principle of santosha. Examine your life with that clear window. Let's go back to that lovely example. What do you see when you're looking at something clearly, when you're looking and examining yourself with that sense of clarity? I would argue that most people can cultivate that contentment and satisfaction quite easily. We are very, very privileged, and it's about recognizing that, and actually that what you have is more than enough.
This might sound surprising, but that was a theme explored in the Barbie movie as well, where Ryan Gosling had to realize he was Knuff. So I just want to put that out there as well.
How funny! You know, I haven't seen this Barbie film, but I understand that it was quite popular, wasn't it?
Cultural moment. Get on board.
Dude, I'm living on the bleeding edge of time here. Do you know what I mean? Am I above such things? No. However, I haven't seen the film, so I'm sorry to everyone that's listening. I'm a terrible, terrible human being.
Now, I've got a feeling that I'm going to be all over the third niyama that we're going to explore. This niyama is tapas. Now, I've been to Barcelona, so I'm pretty much an expert on this, right?
Yeah, you've smashed it. You smashed it. You've nailed it. We're done. We don't need to discuss this any further. No, you're fine. You're all good. However, within the context of yoga, tapas is, again, something that perhaps people may find a little difficult, that doesn't sit very comfortably with people these days. This niyama of tapas really invites us to explore that principle of austerity and of self-discipline. Now, austerity within yogic practice has a subtly different meaning to our common understanding here in the West. It refers to leading a simple, almost Spartan way of life, but it is a life that is embraced willingly with that purpose of self-purification, self-realization. And here I think we can see one of the strongest links between two of the niyamas, and we're going to refer back here to that principle of saucha. A simple, austere almost way of life allows an aspiring yogi an awful lot of mental and physical space with which to examine themselves, to become aware of themselves, embracing wholeheartedly that full experience and practice of the 8 limbs of yoga. Now, this austerity, let's use an example here of the practice of fasting, something that I know has become very, very common and wholeheartedly embraced in the modern world. Intermittent fasting, only eating a certain amount of calories each day. When used with a sense of mindfulness and attentiveness, it is a way of furthering the journey of self-understanding, because it provides you with an opportunity for not just a conceptual but also an experiential examination of a question. Who am I without this? Now, if you've undertaken a period of fasting, either half a day, perhaps a full day, perhaps for a few days or even a week, you will soon become quickly aware and understand that all you can think about for the first few hours of that experience of fasting is food. That's all you can think about. You watch your own mind performing somersaults. It starts to panic, because we've become accustomed and we have become conditioned to this idea that we need to have 3 meals a day. We need to have a little snack in the middle of the afternoon, perhaps a little something before we go to bed at night. We don't need to eat that much food. And it's very easy for me to sit here and say this, but I would invite anyone here, explore the principle, explore what that means to you. What does austerity, what does that Spartan lifestyle, that sense of discipline mean to you? I can only talk from my own experiences here. Of course, fasting is something I do periodically. I'm in the period of one at the minute. Observe how the mind feels. I can guarantee you, after one day of a full fast, your mind will be sharper. You'll discover that you have an awful lot of energy within your body. Why? Because you're examining who you are without this. You are getting to understand yourself. Who are you without this? And I hope that makes sense.
Sounds like you're coming for my second breakfast, but let's not get into that.
I love a second breakfast.
Next up in our journey through the niyamas is Svadhyaya. I'm not saying that correctly, but what's that all about?
I'm going to get you to learn Sanskrit by the end of all of this. Svadhyaya, wonderful. Svadhyaya, it sounds just amazing. Svadhyaya here, it represents the principle of self-study, studying oneself. And again, this applies across the niyamas that we discussed in episode 2, and it applies within the principle of the niyamas, the foundational roots here. Now, Svadhyaya is the specific practice of introspection upon oneself in order to reflect and to learn about who we are. And in a way, we can think of the yamas and the niyamas as those foundational principles, once again, that offer us a guide of learning about ourselves, studying about ourselves. Now, when we consciously take a step outside of our everyday lives, perhaps through the practice of physical yoga, asana practice, or perhaps, as we've said, during a period of fasting, who do we see ourselves as? How does the experience of ourselves change within a different framework of being? And just stepping back slightly here, many people, as I've said, come to yoga after recognizing something within their lives, that they are looking for, perhaps for this deeper meaning. They are looking for a change. They're looking for a transformed experience of who they are and how they live. That is the beginning of this journey of svadhyaya, this journey of studying oneself, learning about oneself outside of a conditioned societal context of who we have been taught that we are, who we believe ourselves to be. And that can sound a little bit complicated. Perhaps there's a little bit of mystical, poetic language that's applied to all of that. But I personally believe that that is very important. When we're discussing yoga, not just the 8 limbs, but the entire science of yoga, a little bit of poetry and a little bit of mysticism is not a bad thing. Human language is shockingly bad at expressing these deeper principles. And I think it's very important for people to, again, study that within themselves. Svadhyaya is also commonly acknowledged as a study of the sacred texts concerning the science of yoga and the wider philosophy of yoga. Now, this study is not for the purpose of following a path of dogmatic rules or expectations that are to be applied uniform across the board. It's not even about agreeing with what has been written within the deep past or even within the recent history of our species. It is to examine yourself within relation to them. Related to this principle of svadhyaya is the principle of svadharma, which translates roughly as one's own self-religion, for want of a better phrase. Perhaps let's call it a self-philosophy. We've begun this journey into yoga. We're learning all sorts of things about ourselves. We're learning a sense of discipline. We're learning a sense of self-reflection, curiosity, modifying the way in which we interact with the world and modifying perhaps the way in which we interact with ourselves. This forms the basis of your svadharma. It forms the basis of your own self-philosophy.
Now, last but not least, the 5th niyama is Isvara Pranadhana. Is it as complicated as it sounds?
Perfect. I told you you'd get it. Isvara Pranidhana is simply the contemplation upon, and perhaps the surrender to, our true self. This final niyama can be seen perhaps as a culmination of the preceding niyamas, when the yogi has contemplated and acknowledged their fundamental attitudes towards themselves. They cultivate, they have cultivated, and they have practiced their ability to recognize and to drop their false identifications in terms of who they believe themselves to be. The process of surrender to the true self begins. Now, this inference of surrender here contained within this practice of Isvara Pranidhana is not one of giving up. It's more of a sense of offering up. The aspirational yogi, anyone that's on this journey of understanding themselves, realizing a little bit more about themselves, applies their discipline towards this sense of offering up a life that is driven by the ego, a life that is driven by desire, perhaps a life that is driven by fear. Through this offering up, through this realization, they can come to see that they contain and are a fundamental part of what we can poetically call the divine whole. Now, this divine whole, in inverted commas, is not to be seen as anything external. We're not talking about a deity here, something outside of ourselves. Yoga is not a religion. Yoga is a philosophy. This divine whole is recognized as the pure truth of who we are. There's a wonderful question here that I think sums up this fifth Niyama, and it's a very useful one to contemplate, and I would invite you and our listeners take a few minutes after the end of this podcast and just ask yourself this question: who are you when you're not being you?
Now that's the 5 niyamas, the second of the 8 limbs of yoga. You touched on this briefly at the start, but I think it's worth sort of going back over. What is the relationship between the yamas that we covered in the first limb in the previous episode and these 5 niyamas that we've been exploring in today's episode?
It's a wonderful thing to look at the yamas and the niyamas together, and they are recognized as the foundational practices in order for any journey of self-exploration, reflection, for the journey of the yogi to move ahead, to get that sense and cultivate that liberation from perhaps a sense of illusion of who they believe themselves to be. There's a very clear interrelationship between each of the yamas and each of the niyamas, and also a recognition that those that apply themselves consistently with that sense of discipline to the full practice of yoga, to the full practice of these principles, therein lies the opportunity and the potential to transform the individual relationship to and an understanding of the inner and the outer world in which you exist. And again, this is not just on a personal, individual level. When we make a sincere, wholehearted journey towards a transformation of self, towards understanding ourselves, that vibration that we create, that change that we create within ourselves, has a positive effect on those that are around us. It has a positive effect on our own existence. We cannot work on our own self-understanding or our own self-awareness and not have a direct effect on the people, the relationships, the environment in which we exist. Human beings throughout history have had this wonderful desire to know ourselves from a bit of a deeper standpoint. It all comes down to those really fundamental questions. We'll examine this a little more in future episodes. Who am I? Why am I here? What the hell is all of this about? How can I make my way through this life? What's the point of all of this? And this is where the yamas and the niyamas offer us something very, very special indeed. They provide us with a solid starting place from which to commence our personal journey and in order to answer those questions. And again, I think I'd like to finish here on just really trying to hammer home that principle. None of this is dogma. None of this is doctrine. Great sage Rishi Patanjali did not mean for the Yoga Sutras, he did not mean for the 8 limbs of yoga to be treated as a text that has to be followed to the letter. This provides a framework. It provides a guidebook. Let's take it further. It provides a map for the journey that lies ahead of you. And that journey is the most beautiful and important journey that any human being can undertake. The realization of yourself and the liberation from your own bullshit.
Well, that brings us to the end of episode 3 of the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at GTV London. If you want to get in touch with Matt or find out more about his online courses and retreats, head over to his website, thebeardednakedyogi.com.
My friends, I shall say thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed episode 3. We will be back with episode 4, where we examine perhaps the most famous of the limbs, asana, the physical postures of yoga.